Captive to Warrior, Edwin Eastman's shocking chronicle of Pedro Vargas's Comanche life. I watched 8 people die by my hand before stealing the girl I desired. Heodaka's confession came without remorse as he and Edwin Eastman shared tobacco beneath the stars. Having witnessed the Comanche's elaborate death rituals during the winter famine, Eastman now confronted something more disturbing, a man who had willingly embraced their most violent traditions. What terrible journey had transformed Pedro Vargas into Heodacha, and what lessons did his story hold for Eastman's own survival? Childhood poverty and the raid, the forging of Heodacha. The night air carried a chill as Heodacha's words hung between them. Edwin Eastman studied the man across the fire, trying to reconcile the brutal confession with the composed figure before him. After enduring months of starvation alongside the Comanche, Eastman thought he understood their ways, but Heodacha represented something altogether different. A white man who had willingly crossed into savagery. "You know me as Heodacha," the warrior said, exhaling smoke from his pipe. "But I was born Pedro Vargas on the banks of the Del Norte River in northern Mexico." Pedro's story began in a world defined by rigid social hierarchies and economic servitude. Born to a bequero, a cattle handler, who worked on the vast hacienda of Don Ramon de Echavarria, Pedro entered life at the bottom of Mexican colonial society. The Vargas family occupied a small adobe structure among dozens of similar dwellings that housed the workers who maintained the sprawling estate. "We were 11 children in a 2-room house," Heodacha explained. "My father earned barely enough to keep us fed. Most nights we had only beans and tortillas. Meat came only when an animal died of natural causes or illness." The hacienda system of the 1830s perpetuated a quasi-feudal arrangement that had existed since Spanish colonization. Large landowners like Don Ramon controlled thousands of acres, while families like the Vargas remained in perpetual debt servitude. Workers received minimal wages, supplemented by small plots for personal cultivation and permission to keep a few chickens or goats. These meager concessions created the illusion of opportunity, while ensuring laborers remained tied to the land. By age 8, Pedro joined his father in the daily work of the hacienda. His small frame bent under loads meant for grown men as he carried water, tools, and supplies across the property. Unlike more fortunate children who occasionally attended mission schools, Pedro received no formal education. His classroom became the dusty expanse of the ranch, his teachers the vaqueros who managed the cattle. Pedro's father possessed unusual skills for a Mexican laborer. Having spent his youth among Comanche raiders before being captured and civilized by Spanish missionaries, he retained knowledge of indigenous horsemanship and survival techniques. These abilities made him valuable to Don Ramon, but also created an unusual heritage for young Pedro. "My father taught me to ride before I could properly walk," Heodacha said, demonstrating with his hands how his father had bound him to a horse with leather straps when he was barely 4. "By 9, I could control a horse with my knees alone, hands free for rope or weapon." This early training distinguished Pedro from other workers' children. While they struggled to stay mounted on docile workhorses, Pedro mastered the Comanche technique of hanging from a galloping horse's side, using its body as a shield. He learned to throw a lazo, a rope with a running noose, with precision that amazed even veteran vaqueros. By 10, he could lasso a specific calf from a running herd, a skill that brought occasional praise from Don Ramon himself. Daily life remained harsh despite these moments of recognition. Pedro rose before the morning light and worked until dark, tending animals, repairing equipment, and performing whatever tasks required his increasingly strong hands. His childhood disappeared beneath calluses and sunburn, his growth stunted by malnutrition, yet his muscles hardened by constant labor. "We were not slaves," Heodacha clarified, seeing Eastman's expression. "We could leave any time. But where would we go? Without land or money, freedom meant starvation." The hacienda operated as a self-contained world with its own social hierarchy. At the bottom stood workers like Pedro's family, technically free but economically bound to the land. Above them were the skilled laborers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and experienced vaqueros. At the top stood Don Ramon and his family, living in a stone mansion that seemed like a palace to young Pedro. Between these worlds moved the capatazes, overseers who enforced the hacienda's rules with whips and threats. Pedro learned early to avoid their attention, to work silently and efficiently, becoming nearly invisible except when his skills were required. This rigid system created in Pedro a complex relationship with authority. He obeyed outwardly while harboring growing resentment. When no one watched, he practiced with a small knife his father had given him, imagining the blade against the throat of a particularly cruel capataz. Each night, Hiyodaka told Eastman, I fell asleep with the same thought: someday I would command respect, not beg for it. The event that transformed Pedro's life came in the autumn of 1838, when he was 11 years old. A large Comanche war party had ventured deep into Chihuahua territory, seeking glory and plunder. After suffering an unexpected defeat at the provincial capital, they retreated without captives or scalps, an unacceptable outcome that would bring shame upon their return to the tribe. Warriors cannot return empty-handed, Hiyodaka explained. They diverted to the Pecos River settlements where my family lived. These areas rarely saw raids, so no one maintained proper watches. The hacienda of Don Ramon became their first target. The attack came early in the morning, when most workers were already in the fields, but before full alertness set in. The Comanche swept through like a dust storm, killing Don Ramon and his 3 sons before they could organize a defense. Pedro's father died trying to protect the main house, his body found with 5 arrows in his chest. I grabbed Conchita, my 16-year-old sister, and we hid in the irrigation ditch, Hiyodaka said. We might have escaped if she hadn't screamed when they set fire to our family's quarters. The warriors discovered them immediately. Pedro fought with his small knife, but was quickly overpowered. Rather than killing him, the raiders seemed impressed by his fierce resistance, despite his youth and size. They bound both siblings and threw them across spare horses. By nightfall, Pedro and Conchita, along with 14 other captives, were traveling north with their captors. The journey to the Comanche territory forced Pedro to witness brutality beyond anything he had experienced on the hacienda. Captives who couldn't keep pace were killed without hesitation, their scalps taken as consolation prizes. An elderly woman who repeatedly fell from her horse was abandoned alive, left to die slowly of exposure and thirst. A young man who attempted escape was recaptured, tortured for hours, then burned alive as an example to the others. You know this journey, Hiyodaka said, nodding at Eastman. The difference was my sister. Her beauty saved us both. Conchita's striking appearance had caught the attention of a sub-chief named Tall Bear. By the second night, he had claimed her as his future wife, which immediately improved both siblings' treatment. They received better food and were allowed to ride more comfortably. Tall Bear even assigned a warrior to ensure Pedro didn't fall behind. The raid that claimed Pedro and Conchita reflected a pattern of Comanche expansion that had been reshaping the borderlands since the early 1700s. Armed with horses and superior mobility, Comanche bands had pushed south from the Great Plains, displacing Apache groups and challenging Spanish control. By the 1830s, they dominated a vast territory stretching from central Texas to eastern New Mexico, with raiding parties penetrating hundreds of miles into Mexico. These raids served multiple purposes in Comanche society. They provided economic resources through captured livestock and goods, increased tribal population through adoption of captives, and offered warriors opportunities to demonstrate courage and skill. Young men could not achieve adult status without participating in successful raids, creating constant pressure for new expeditions regardless of external political conditions. For children like Pedro, captivity typically meant complete cultural transformation. Young captives were adopted into Comanche families, given new names, and raised as tribal members. Their previous identities were systematically erased through language immersion, participation in tribal rituals, and deliberate separation from other captives of similar background. Upon reaching the Comanche village after 15 days of travel, the captives faced the traditional gauntlet, forced to run between 2 lines of women wielding sticks and whips. Many captives suffered serious injuries during this ritual, but Tall Bear intervened before Conchita's turn, declaring her his property. As her brother, Pedro received partial protection, enduring fewer blows than the others. The women hit me, Hiyodaka recalled, but not with full strength. I still have scars on my back, but I kept my teeth, unlike the Mexican man who ran before me. As the fire between them burned lower, Eastman studied Hiodacha's face, searching for any trace of the Mexican boy who had been Pedro Vargas. He found none. The transformation had been complete, from the warrior's braided hair, adorned with eagle feathers, to the distinctive Comanche scarification on his chest. Even his speech patterns when speaking English carried the rhythms and inflections of Comanche language. "You think I should have resisted," Hiodacha said, reading Eastman's expression. "That I betrayed my people by becoming Comanche." Eastman didn't respond immediately, considering his own experience. He had maintained his identity through captivity, viewing himself always as separate from the Comanche, despite learning their ways. Pedro had taken a different path, embracing transformation rather than merely adapting for survival. "I made a choice," Hiodacha continued. "The Comanche offered what Mexican society never would: power, respect, freedom. Why would I cling to memories of servitude when I could become a warrior?" This pragmatic view of cultural identity challenged Eastman's assumptions about captivity. For Pedro, becoming Comanche wasn't surrender but opportunity, a calculated decision that offered better prospects than his previous life had provided. This realization sent a chill through Eastman that had nothing to do with the night air. "Your story continues," Eastman prompted, curious despite his revulsion at the casual description of violence. "What happened next?" Hiodacha exhaled a cloud of smoke, his eyes reflecting the dying fire. "Next came my years as a captive, though not for long. Soon I would take my first scalp, and with it, my place among the people. The early years of captivity and integration, first and second years. When Pedro Vargas arrived at the Comanche village with the other captives, the stark reality of his new existence settled upon him like a heavy blanket. The village bustled with activity, women tanning hides, children running between tipis, warriors tending to horses. For Pedro, this foreign world would become home through circumstances, not of his choosing. The captives were typically distributed among families, serving as laborers or adopted to replace deceased relatives. Pedro's fate, however, took an unexpected turn. His sister Conchita, with her striking beauty and dignified bearing, caught the attention of a prominent chief. Their union, while not of Conchita's choosing, created a protective shield around Pedro that other captives did not enjoy. "My brother will be treated with respect," Conchita had insisted to her new husband, a rare demand from a captive woman. The chief, perhaps to please his new wife or perhaps recognizing something valuable in the young Mexican, agreed. During those first 2 years, Pedro's life stabilized into a routine that, while difficult, was not unbearable. He learned the Comanche language through daily immersion, his quick mind absorbing vocabulary and grammar with remarkable speed. He observed tribal customs, helped tend horses, and assisted with hunting preparations. The Comanche, notorious for their horsemanship, impressed Pedro with their riding skills, a talent he would later master himself. Mexican captives faced varied treatment within Comanche society. Some remained perpetual outsiders, while others achieved integration through demonstrated loyalty and usefulness. Pedro belonged to the latter category, showing aptitude for tribal life that did not go unnoticed by the elders. Coming of age in the warrior's path, early third year, age 20. At the beginning of his third year, among the Comanche, when Pedro was approximately 18 years old, the tribe conducted a formal initiation ceremony. Such rituals typically marked a young Comanche man's transition to warrior status, but Pedro's case presented unique challenges. Though not born into the tribe, his growing proficiency with their language and customs made him increasingly valuable. The ceremony took place during the summer moon. Pedro stood before the tribal council, his body painted with symbolic patterns in red and black. The tribal shaman presented him with a specially crafted knife, a physical representation of his new status. Though Pedro was not Comanche by blood, the tribe had decided to treat him as an equal to their own untested young men. "You have lived among us as a shadow," the chief Tansoroyo told him during the ceremony. "Now you will walk in the light of the tribe, if your heart proves strong." Several months later, Pedro joined a war party led by a minor chief. The expedition targeted a small Mexican settlement near the Rio Grande. During this raid, Pedro took his first 2 scalps, an act that solidified his position as a warrior and marked his complete psychological break from his Mexican identity. The physical act of scalping enemy combatants represented more than mere violence. It signified Pedro's full embrace of Comanche martial values and his rejection of his former culture. The young man discovered in himself an appetite for the adventurous life of a Comanche warrior. The raiding parties offered excitement, status, and material wealth through plunder. Pedro participated in every available expedition, earning a reputation for boldness that sometimes bordered on recklessness. His natural agility and quick thinking served him well in combat situations. Fortune favored Pedro in these early campaigns. He avoided serious injury while accumulating scalps and plunder at a rate that impressed even veteran warriors. By age 20, tribal members recognized him as one of their premier fighters, a remarkable achievement for a captive-turned-warrior. Pedro's charisma and success attracted followers. Young, adventurous warriors began to seek his company, eager to join him on raids. This core group formed the beginning of what would eventually become Pedro's own warband. They admired his daring tactics and the consistent success of his ventures. Despite this growing influence, Pedro yearned for formal leadership recognition. The position of war chief would grant him the authority to lead larger expeditions and gain greater glory. Repeatedly, he approached Tanceroyo requesting permission to lead his own war party, presenting his accomplishments as evidence of his readiness. "I have brought more horses and scalps than warriors born to the tribe," Pedro argued during one council meeting. "Let me lead men against our enemies, and I will bring even greater honor." Tanceroyo, however, remained cautious. While acknowledging Pedro's contributions, the chief hesitated to elevate a former captive to such a prominent position. The tribal politics demanded careful navigation, and Tanceroyo understood that some traditional members might resent Pedro's rapid rise. Each time Pedro made his request, the chief found diplomatic reasons to postpone the decision. This frustration only fueled Pedro's determination. He redoubled his efforts in subsequent raids, taking increasingly bold actions to prove his worth. The pattern established during these formative years, his exceptional combat skills, his ambition, and his growing network of loyal followers, would ultimately shape Pedro Vargas into one of the most formidable warriors the Comanche had ever incorporated into their ranks. The unauthorized raid and failure around age 20, frustrated by Tanceroyo's continued refusal to grant him war chief status, Pedro Vargas decided to take matters into his own hands. Operating in secrecy, he approached warriors who had shown loyalty to him during previous raids, carefully selecting those he believed would follow him without official sanction. The glory waits for those bold enough to claim it. Pedro told his confidants as they gathered in a secluded ravine away from the main camp. "Will you ride with me to wealth and honor?" Through personal charisma and promises of plunder, Pedro convinced approximately 30 warriors to join his unauthorized expedition. Many were young men eager to prove themselves, while others were established fighters who respected Pedro's combat record. Their preparation was methodical, weapons were sharpened, horses selected for both stamina and speed, and supplies gathered discreetly. To avoid suspicion, Pedro fabricated a hunting expedition as their cover story. The group departed at dawn, ostensibly seeking buffalo on the plains. Once beyond sight of the village, they altered course toward Mexican settlements. Their journey took them across the Llano Estacado, the vast, staked plains that served as a natural barrier between Comanche territory and Mexican settlements. They followed the upper Pecos River before turning westward to cross the Rio Grande. The war party moved with tactical precision. They traveled primarily at night, concealing themselves during daylight hours to avoid detection by rival Apache bands, particularly the Lipan and Kagwa, who controlled portions of the territory. Pedro's knowledge of both Comanche and Mexican ways proved invaluable during this journey, allowing him to anticipate potential threats and navigate unfamiliar terrain. Pedro's strategy was conservative by Comanche raiding standards. Rather than attacking well-defended towns, he planned to target isolated haciendas where resistance would be minimal. His primary objective was not wholesale slaughter, but rather a successful raid with moderate plunder and a few scalps. enough to impress Tanceroyo upon their return while minimizing casualties among his warriors. After crossing the Rio Grande, the first hacienda they approached was ironically the very estate where Pedro had spent his childhood, now owned by Don Rafael de Echeverra. The property had changed significantly since Pedro's youth, with new buildings and expanded livestock operations. What Pedro failed to anticipate was the presence of American hunters at the hacienda, guests of Don Rafael who had traveled from Santa Fe. Two of these hunters, experienced frontiersmen accustomed to reading the landscape for signs of danger, discovered tracks left by Pedro's war party while on a hunting expedition. Recognizing the distinctive pattern of unshod Comanche ponies, they immediately returned to warn the hacienda. Indians, one hunter announced upon their urgent return. Comanche by the look of it, at least 30 moving this way. Don Rafael, a veteran of frontier life, immediately organized the hacienda's defense. Workers barricaded windows, distributed weapons, and positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the compound. By the time Pedro led his warriors in what he expected to be a surprise attack, the hacienda was prepared for battle. The raid began at first light. Pedro led the charge toward the main house, expecting minimal resistance. Instead, his warriors were met with coordinated rifle fire from multiple positions. The Americans, expert marksmen, focused their fire on warriors who appeared to be leaders. Pedro, riding at the front of the formation, became an immediate target. A rifle ball struck him in the shoulder, spinning him from his horse. As he fell, his leg twisted beneath him, resulting in a compound fracture. The sight of their leader fallen and the unexpected resistance threw the raiding party into disarray. Despite Pedro's shouts for them to continue the attack, the warriors retreated in confusion, abandoning their wounded leader to his fate. As the Comanche disappeared into the distance, Pedro lay in the dust of the hacienda courtyard, captured by the very people he had come to raid. When the Americans approached the wounded raider, they were stunned to discover that beneath the Comanche paint and attire was a man with distinctly European features. This revelation provoked immediate outrage. "A white man leading Indians against his own kind," spat one of the hunters, raising his rifle to execute Pedro on the spot. "There's only one cure for that kind of treachery." Don Rafael intervened, placing himself between Pedro and the furious Americans. Though he shared their disgust, the Mexican landowner felt a cultural obligation toward a fellow countryman, regardless of his crimes. "He is Mexican, not American," Don Rafael stated firmly. "On my land, justice will be administered according to our ways." Instead of summary execution, Don Rafael ordered his household physician to treat Pedro's wounds. The broken leg required setting and splinting, while the shoulder wound, though painful, had fortunately missed vital organs. For nearly 2 months, Pedro remained bedridden, his fate uncertain once he recovered. During this period of convalescence, Pedro's story became known throughout the hacienda. He crafted a narrative designed to elicit sympathy, claiming he had been forced to participate in the raid under threat of death from Comanche leaders. He carefully concealed his role as the raid's instigator and commander. "They would have killed me if I refused," Pedro told Don Rafael during one of the landowner's visits to his sick room. "I have prayed every day for escape from their control." His youth, barely 20 years old, lent credibility to this deception. The household staff, initially hostile, gradually softened toward the injured captive. They saw him as a victim of circumstances rather than a willing participant in violence against his own people. This perception was reinforced by Pedro's apparent gratitude and his quick readaptation to Mexican customs and language. After a month of complete recovery, when Pedro could walk with only a slight limp, Don Rafael made him an unexpected offer. "You know horses well," the landowner observed. "My ranch needs skilled vaqueros. Work for me, and you can rebuild your life among your own people." Pedro accepted the offer with apparent gratitude. Privately, however, he had already resolved to return to the Comanche at the first opportunity. His decision to remain temporarily at the hacienda served 2 purposes. He was reluctant to return to the tribe empty-handed after such a humiliating failure, and he had developed another, more personal objective. Don Rafael's household included his wife, Doña Maria, and their 15-year-old daughter, Guadalupe. The girl possessed remarkable beauty, with long dark hair, expressive eyes, and the refined manners of a wealthy hacendado's daughter. From his sickbed, Pedro had observed her with growing obsession, developing a plan to abduct her when he eventually escaped. Despite Pedro's attempts to charm Guadalupe during his recovery, the young woman remained distant and suspicious. She avoided being alone in his presence and often watched him with undisguised distrust. "There is something wrong in his eyes," she confided to her mother. "He watches me as a coyote watches a lamb." Guadalupe's aversion only intensified Pedro's fixation. In his distorted reasoning, capturing her would serve multiple purposes: personal gratification, revenge against Don Rafael for his captivity, and a prestigious prize to present to the tribe upon his return. This obsession grew daily as Pedro worked as a vaquero, biding his time and planning his eventual escape. Brutal action and escape after recovery. Don Rafael's hacienda was constructed in the traditional Spanish colonial style, a single-story square structure of stone with thick walls surrounding a central courtyard. The compound was enclosed by an outer wall with a large gate that served as the primary entrance. Following Pedro's raid, security had been temporarily strengthened with additional guards and vigilant patrols. However, as weeks passed without incident, the heightened vigilance gradually relaxed to normal routines. The American hunters, whose frontier experience had proven invaluable during the Comanche attack, had long since departed to continue their journey to Santa Fe. Their absence removed the most suspicious and observant eyes from the property, creating an opportunity that Pedro carefully monitored. During his months working as a vaquero, Pedro memorized every aspect of the hacienda: guard rotations, sleeping arrangements, locations of valuables, and most importantly, the habits of the household members. He noted which servants rose earliest, which rooms were occupied at night, and the location of Guadalupe's quarters. Nothing escaped his calculating observation. Pedro selected a moonless night in late autumn for his plan. The darkness would provide natural concealment, and the cool weather meant windows would be closed, containing any sounds. In preparation, he had quietly identified and secured the 2 fastest Mustangs from Don Rafael's herd, hiding them in a small arroyo half a mile from the main compound. He stocked minimal provisions, only what was necessary for a hard ride north. From his time with the Comanche, Pedro had learned about various medicinal and poisonous plants. He had located a particular herb known for its powerful sedative properties, which the Comanche sometimes used during extended hunting expeditions to induce deep sleep. Over several days, he gathered and prepared this herb, grinding it into a fine powder. On the chosen evening, Pedro volunteered to help in the kitchen, an unusual but not suspicious offer given his apparent gratitude toward the household. While the cook was momentarily distracted, he sprinkled the sedative into a pot of evening stew, carefully avoiding the portion that would be served to Guadalupe, whom he intended to take conscious. "The meat is especially tender tonight," Don Rafael commented during the meal, unaware of what he was consuming. Within an hour after dinner, the household fell into an unnaturally deep slumber. Pedro waited patiently until midnight, then began his assault. He accessed the flat roof, the azotea, using an exterior ladder that was left in place for maintenance. From there, he entered the house through a roof access point commonly used for ventilation. Pedro moved through the darkened hallways with practiced stealth, a knife from the kitchen secured in his hand. He entered Don Rafael's bedroom first, approaching the sleeping form of the man who had saved his life. Without hesitation or remorse, Pedro plunged the knife directly into Don Rafael's heart, ensuring instant death with minimal sound. With practiced efficiency, he then took the man's scalp, a gruesome trophy that would later validate his story to the Comanche. Moving through the house, Pedro killed 7 more people, servants and workers who had shown him kindness during his recovery. Each murder was executed with the same precision, and each victim was scalped. The household's deep drug-induced sleep prevented any alarm from being raised as Pedro moved from room to room. Aware that time was limited, Pedro gathered items that would be valuable by Comanche standards: silver ornaments, weapons, and particularly fine blankets. He bundled these items together with rawhide strips and lowered them to the ground using a rope he had hidden on the roof days earlier. Finally, Pedro approached Guadalupe's room. The young woman lay sleeping, unaware of the slaughter that had taken place throughout her home. Pedro bound her wrists and ankles with rawhide strips and gagged her using Comanche techniques designed to prevent any sound. He wrapped her in a blanket to restrict her movement and lifted her onto his shoulder. With his human prize secured, Pedro carried Guadalupe to the roof and carefully lowered her to the ground using the same rope. Despite her attempts to struggle, the bindings held firm. Pedro worked quickly, loading his stolen goods onto one horse and placing Guadalupe across the saddle of the second. He mounted behind her, securing her body against his to prevent any escape attempt, and rode northwest at a gallop. Pedro pushed the horses hard through the night, knowing that discovery of his crimes would trigger immediate pursuit. His destination was the Rio Grande crossing he had used during his raid months earlier, a shallow ford known primarily to indigenous travelers. By dawn, they had covered considerable distance, the hacienda far behind them as they approached the river. As they passed through a dense thicket near the river crossing, Pedro encountered an unexpected complication. A Mexican hunter from the hacienda, who had been tracking deer since before dawn, suddenly appeared on the trail before them. The man instantly recognized both Pedro and the bound Guadalupe. "Pedro, what have you?" The hunter's question was cut short as Pedro swung a steel war club, taken from Don Rafael's weapons collection, with devastating force. The heavy metal crushed the man's skull, killing him instantly. Without pause, Pedro dismounted, took the hunter's scalp, and collected his weapons and supplies, a rifle, ammunition pouch, and knife that would prove valuable during the journey ahead. The unexpected encounter heightened Pedro's urgency. He knew the hunter's absence would eventually be noted, potentially accelerating any pursuit from the hacienda once the murders were discovered. Pedro forced the horses to an even faster pace, crossing the Rio Grande by mid-morning and continuing into the vast expanse beyond. By nightfall, Pedro had put significant distance between himself and any potential pursuers. He finally allowed the exhausted horses a brief rest in a concealed canyon. There, he loosened Guadalupe's gag momentarily to give her water. "Why?" she asked, her voice hoarse from hours of silent terror. "My father saved your life." Pedro offered no explanation, replacing the gag and securing her to a tree while he made minimal preparations for the night. The look in his eyes told Guadalupe everything she needed to know. She was no longer among civilized people, but in the hands of someone who had fully embraced the most brutal aspects of Comanche warfare. Return to the tribe and consolidation of status after escape. As dawn broke over their makeshift camp, Guadalupe regained full consciousness from her state of shock and terror. When Pedro briefly removed her gag to provide water, she attempted to reason with her captor. "My father will pay any ransom you demand," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "There is no need for this. Please return me to my family." Pedro regarded her with detached indifference. The young man who had once been a Mexican captive now embodied the Comanche warrior mindset completely. Her pleas fell on deaf ears as he prepared for the final leg of their journey to Comanche territory. Pedro understood that her value lay not in ransom, but in her status as a war prize, living proof of his daring and skill. The journey northward was fraught with danger. Pedro navigated carefully to avoid Mexican patrols, Apache war parties, and American trappers who might interfere with his return. He traveled primarily at night, concealing their trail with techniques learned from Comanche scouts. During daylight hours, they remained hidden in arroyos or dense thickets, moving only when absolutely necessary. Water was scarce as they crossed the arid landscape, forcing Pedro to ration their supplies carefully. Game was hunted sparingly to avoid creating smoke that might attract attention. Despite these precautions, they narrowly avoided detection several times, once by a Mexican cavalry patrol searching for raiders, and again by a band of Lipan Apache hunters whose territory they crossed. After 2 weeks of arduous travel, Pedro and his captive finally reached the Comanche village. Their arrival created an immediate sensation. Warriors gathered around as Pedro rode proudly into the camp, displaying his scalps and presenting Guadalupe as evidence of his successful raid. "We thought the Mexicans had killed you," exclaimed one of the warriors who had abandoned Pedro during the failed raid months earlier. "Your spirit has returned from the land of the dead." The survivors of Pedro's unauthorized expedition had returned to the village with tales of his demise, describing how he had fallen in battle at the hacienda. His reappearance, accompanied by scalps and a beautiful captive, seemed nothing short of miraculous to many in the tribe. Tanzarroyo, though initially displeased by Pedro's unauthorized raid, could not deny the impressive nature of his accomplishment. The young warrior had single-handedly succeeded where a larger party had failed, and had returned with valuable plunder. This demonstration of individual prowess aligned perfectly with Comanche values that prized personal courage and combat effectiveness. The tribe celebrated Pedro's return with elaborate ceremonies. A scalp dance was organized, where warriors performed around a central pole adorned with the scalps Pedro had taken. The rhythmic movements and chanting continued through the night, honoring both the returning warrior and the spirits of successful combat. Feasting followed, with Pedro given a position of honor beside tribal leaders. This dramatic return completely restored Pedro's standing in the tribe. What might have been viewed as a reckless failure was transformed into a legendary tale of survival and revenge. Young warriors looked to him with renewed admiration, while even the elders acknowledged his exceptional courage, if not his judgment. Guadalupe became one of Pedro's wives according to Comanche custom. Despite her initial resistance, she gradually adapted to tribal life as many captives did, learning the language and customs out of necessity. Pedro displayed a particular attachment to her that he did not show toward his other wives, keeping her in his personal lodge and providing her with the finest available goods. This preference persisted until her death 3 years later from a fever that swept through the camp during a particularly harsh winter. Approximately 1 year after Pedro's return, while he was away leading a small raiding party against settlements along the Brazos River, his sister Conchita succumbed to an illness that had been slowly weakening her for months. Her death severed Pedro's last connection to his Mexican heritage. Without Conchita's calming influence, Pedro became even more deeply immersed in Comanche culture, adopting their worldview completely. "My blood is now Comanche," Pedro declared during a tribal gathering following his sister's death. The Mexican boy died long ago. In the years that followed, Pedro led a series of successful expeditions against Mexican settlements, American traders, and rival tribes. His tactical knowledge of both worlds proved invaluable. He understood the defensive weaknesses of Mexican haciendas and the trading patterns of American merchants. This insight allowed him to strike when and where his targets were most vulnerable. Pedro's consistent success led Tanzarroyo to elevate him to the position of sub-chief, granting him formal authority to lead larger war parties. The promotion recognized both his military accomplishments and his growing influence among younger warriors. Pedro embraced these responsibilities eagerly, viewing each new mission as an opportunity to further enhance his reputation. He developed a particular specialty for dangerous missions that other leaders might hesitate to undertake. Deep raids into heavily patrolled territories, attacks on well-defended settlements, and missions requiring extended travel through hostile lands. Pedro relished the fame these high-risk ventures brought him when successful, carefully cultivating his image as a fearless and nearly supernatural warrior. "Pedro sees in darkness what others cannot see in daylight" became a common saying among his followers, referring to his uncanny ability to anticipate enemy movements and find safe passages through dangerous territory. Despite these achievements, certain tribal honors remained beyond Pedro's reach. He never secured a seat on the tribal council, nor did he achieve the highest rank of war chief. Pedro attributed this limitation to the lingering suspicion of Tanzarroyo and another influential elder named Wacomecla, who never fully trusted the former captive despite his proven loyalty. This glass ceiling did little to diminish Pedro's operational freedom. He continued to lead his personal war band on increasingly ambitious raids, always returning with horses, weapons, captives, and other plunder. His warriors developed a fierce loyalty to him, following his commands without question and adopting his aggressive tactical approach. "To ride with Pedro is to return with glory," his followers would say, contrasting their successes with the occasionally more cautious approaches of other war leaders. By his mid-20s, Pedro had transformed completely, from the frightened Mexican captive to one of the most feared Comanche warriors along the frontier. His name became known throughout the borderlands, whispered with dread in Mexican settlements and American trading posts alike. What few outside the tribe understood was how thoroughly Pedro had embraced not just the external trappings of Comanche life, but its underlying values and worldview. In his mind, he was no longer pretending to be Comanche. He had become Comanche in every way that mattered. Exploits and character. As Pedro's status within the tribe solidified, he began sharing stories of his exploits with select listeners, including Edwin Eastman. During one such evening around the fire, Pedro recounted a particularly significant raid that had cemented his reputation as a tactical genius among the Comanche. Stone Juan, who carries the title of sub-chief but lacks the heart of a true warrior, once led 200 men to capture horses from the Mexicans, Pedro explained, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. After many days, they returned with only 8 horses and had lost 5 warriors. The shame of this failure hung over our camp like a dark cloud. In the aftermath of this humiliating expedition, numerous young warriors approached Pedro privately, seeking an opportunity to restore honor to themselves and the tribe. They saw in Pedro a leader who could succeed where the more established sub-chief had failed. Many begged to follow me, Pedro continued, but I selected only 15, the most courageous and disciplined warriors who would follow my commands without question. Rather than targeting the same Mexican settlements that had repelled Stone Juan's larger force, Pedro made a bold and controversial decision. He would attack a Lipan Apache village despite an existing peace agreement between the two tribes. This choice reflected Pedro's pragmatic approach to warfare. He prioritized success and glory over diplomatic considerations. Pedro dispatched scouts to locate a suitable target, eventually identifying a Lipan village of 17 lodges situated near a tributary of the Colorado River. For several days, his scouts observed the village, noting its defenses, the number of warriors present, and their daily routines. Pedro used this intelligence to develop a meticulous attack plan. We approached in the darkest hour before dawn, Pedro recalled. I positioned warriors at every escape route while keeping our main force concealed until the perfect moment. The attack began with devastating suddenness. Pedro's warriors descended upon the sleeping village from multiple directions simultaneously, creating chaos and preventing any organized defense. The Lipan, caught completely unprepared, suffered heavy casualties in the initial assault. We showed no mercy, Pedro stated matter-of-factly. Every warrior who resisted was killed. Those who surrendered became our prisoners. By sunrise, the brief but brutal conflict had ended. Pedro's small force had killed 39 Lipan warriors and captured 48 women and children. They also seized a herd of more than 200 horses, the primary objective of most Comanche raids. Remarkably, Pedro's force suffered no fatalities, though 3 warriors sustained minor wounds. The Lipan survivors attempted to organize a pursuit, gathering warriors from nearby camps. Pedro, anticipating this response, had prepared an elaborate series of false trails and ambush points. He split his force into smaller groups, each taking different routes with portions of the captured horses and prisoners, before reuniting at a predetermined location several days later. The Lipan trackers followed our false trails until they became confused and exhausted, Pedro explained with evident satisfaction. By the time they realized our true direction, we were already beyond their reach. This spectacular success against a formidable enemy with such a small force brought Pedro unprecedented admiration within the tribe. Even Tansarroyo, who had often regarded Pedro with suspicion, publicly acknowledged the raid as a masterpiece of Comanche warfare. The contrast between Pedro's efficient victory and Stone Juan's earlier failure was impossible to ignore. Building on this triumph, Pedro led numerous similar expeditions in the following years. He typically commanded groups of no more than 50 warriors, carefully selecting those who would attribute success primarily to his leadership rather than claiming individual glory. This approach ensured that each successful raid enhanced Pedro's personal reputation rather than elevating potential rivals. Pedro then shared a story that revealed the more impulsive and brutal aspects of his character. During what had begun as a routine hunting expedition with 5 young warriors, They encountered a small band of Pawnee Picts, Wichita, who were also hunting buffalo on the southern plains. Despite the general peace that existed between the Comanche and this tribe, Pedro saw an opportunity for personal gain. They did not see us watching them from the tall grass, Pedro recounted. Though we had no quarrel with the Pawnee Picts, their horses were strong and their weapons good. I decided we would take them. Without consulting his companions about the wisdom of attacking allies, Pedro organized an ambush along a narrow ravine where the Pawnee Picts would pass. When the unsuspecting hunters entered the ravine, Pedro's group attacked from elevated positions, killing 8 Pawnee Picts in the initial volley of arrows. The survivors fled, abandoning their horses and equipment. We took their scalps and gathered their horses, Pedro continued, but our celebration was brief. By nightfall, a much larger force of Pawnee Picts had found our trail. The pursuers, numbering more than 30 warriors, tracked Pedro's small group to a rocky hillside where they had taken shelter. For 3 days, the Pawnee Picts laid siege to the position, launching repeated assaults that Pedro's warriors repelled with difficulty. During one such attack, Pedro personally killed a prominent Pawnee Pict warrior who had advanced ahead of his companions. I took his scalp while his friends watched from below, Pedro recalled, displaying the callousness that had become characteristic of his warfare. Realizing they were completely surrounded and running low on water, Pedro devised a daring escape plan. Under cover of darkness and a sudden thunderstorm, the 6 Comanche warriors slipped between the Pawnee Pict sentries, abandoning their position but taking their collected scalps and weapons. We traveled for 10 days without stopping to make fire, Pedro explained. We ate raw meat and moved only at night until we were certain no one followed. When Pedro's group finally returned to their village, 18 days after departing on what should have been a brief hunting trip, they brought 9 scalps and had sustained only 1 minor injury. The tribe received them with astonishment and admiration, particularly when they learned the small party had successfully evaded a much larger force of pursuers. These are but 2 stories among hundreds I could tell, Pedro concluded, his voice carrying a note of pride. My years have been filled with such exploits. The Comanche know me as Hiso Dicha, the fierce eagle, because I strike quickly and carry away my prey before others can react. As Pedro finished his narrative, Edwin Eastman expressed admiration and a desire to join one of Pedro's war parties. I would like to ride with you in battle, Hiso Cha, Eastman ventured, using Pedro's Comanche name. Pedro regarded the white captive with a mixture of amusement and skepticism. That would be difficult, he replied. Wakomekla does not trust palefaces in war, even those who speak our tongue. But perhaps you could convince Stonewan to take you when the moon is full again. He is more willing to prove himself with unusual warriors. The conversation ended as the camp prepared for sleep. Pedro retired to his lodge while Eastman returned to his assigned dwelling, his mind racing with thoughts of Pedro's stories. Though outwardly expressing interest in joining a war party, Eastman privately harbored hopes that such an expedition might provide an opportunity for escape, a chance to flee the captivity that Pedro had so thoroughly embraced. As Eastman lay awake that night, he reflected on the remarkable transformation of Pedro Vargas. The Mexican captive had not merely adapted to Comanche life, but had embraced its most violent aspects with unnerving enthusiasm. Pedro's story represented both a cautionary tale and a fascinating case study in how completely a person could abandon one identity for another when placed in extraordinary circumstances. What remained unclear to Eastman was whether Pedro's brutal nature had always existed, merely waiting for the freedom of Comanche society to express itself, or whether it had been created through the trauma of captivity and the necessity of survival. This question would continue to trouble Eastman long after his eventual escape from the tribe that Pedro had chosen to call his own.